If this story doesn't make you lock your doors tonight, nothing will. Subscribe, smash that like button, and turn on notifications, because once you fall into this one, there is no way out. Let's go. The East River does not forgive. It moves slow and black beneath the bridges of New York City, carrying whatever the city throws away. Secrets, garbage, sometimes people. And sitting right in the middle of that cold, indifferent water, connected to the rest of the world by a single narrow bridge, is a place that most New Yorkers never talk about, but everyone knows is there. Rikers Island. 400 acres of concrete and wire and human desperation, sitting between Queens and the Bronx like a scar the city cannot quite hide. On the surface, it is a jail, not even a prison, a holding facility, a place where people wait, where the system parks human beings who have not yet been convicted of anything, who are technically still innocent in the eyes of the law, while their cases crawl through an overwhelmed court system that could take months or years to reach a verdict. But do not let that technicality fool you. What happens inside Rikers Island has nothing to do with innocence. The story that brought investigators, journalists, and federal oversight committees to the edge of their seats did not begin with a murder, though a murder would eventually come. It began with a transfer request, a single sheet of paperwork filed on a Tuesday morning in March 2019 by a 31-year-old corrections officer named Daniel Reyes. Reyes had worked the North Infirmary Command at Rikers for 6 years. He had seen things that most people spend their entire lives hoping never to witness. He had walked the corridors where men were warehoused 23 hours a day, where the smell of mold and violence clung to the walls, where the unofficial rules of the jail were written not in any handbook, but in the scars on men's faces. He was not, by any account, a soft man. Former co-workers would later describe him as steady, composed, someone who could walk into a cell extraction without flinching. But something changed in the winter of 2019. Colleagues noticed it first. Reyes stopped eating in the common break room. He started arriving to work early and leaving exactly on time. Not a minute of overtime, which was unusual for an officer who had always been known for pulling double shifts when the facility was short-staffed. He stopped making eye contact in the hallways. And then there was the transfer request, stamped and filed without explanation, without the customary conversation with the supervisor. His request was denied. 3 weeks later, Daniel Reyes did not show up for his shift. That alone was not unheard of at Rikers. Officers called out all the time. The facility ran chronically understaffed, and absenteeism was a crisis the Department of Correction had been fighting for years. A no-call, no-show was flagged, recorded, and buried under the avalanche of daily administrative chaos. But when Reyes missed a second shift, and then a third, someone finally picked up the phone and called his emergency contact. His mother, Carmen Reyes, a 62-year-old retired home health aide living in the Bronx, told the caller something that made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. She had not spoken to her son in 11 days. That was not normal. Daniel called his mother every Sunday without fail. He had not missed a Sunday call in 6 years, not once, not even when he was sick, not even when they had argued, which according to Carmen was rare, because Daniel was not the arguing type. He was the quiet type, the type who carried things alone. Carmen had already called the police. She had filed a missing persons report 5 days earlier. The report had been logged, assigned a case number, and sent to the bottom of a pile. When investigators finally began pulling threads in April of 2019, what they found was not a clean trail. It was a tangle, a web of relationships, loyalties, and buried grievances that stretched from the administrative offices of Rikers all the way into some of the most dangerous gang hierarchies operating inside its walls. The first thing they pulled was surveillance footage from the facility's interior cameras, specifically the North Infirmary Command, covering the last week of Daniel Reyes's employment. Most of the footage was unremarkable. Officers moving through corridors, meal deliveries, medication rounds, the grinding, gray routine of a facility that never sleeps and never stops. But on the night of February the 28th, something appeared on camera that no one could immediately explain. At 2:17 in the morning, Daniel Reyes is seen walking alone down the corridor of the NIC block. He is not in his uniform. He is in civilian clothes, which is a violation, something that would have gotten him written up under any other circumstances. He is moving quickly, and he is carrying a manila envelope pressed flat against his ribs, held tight to his body the way you hold something you do not want anyone to see. He stops outside a cell. The cell belongs to a man named Marcus Webb, 38 years old, a pretrial detainee who had been sitting on Rikers for 14 months awaiting trial on federal racketeering charges. Webb was not a small figure in the world Rikers contained. He was connected, feared, and according to confidential informant reports that had been circulating through federal task forces for the better part of 2 years, he was running operations from inside his cell with a level of sophistication that made corrections officials deeply uncomfortable. Reyes slides the envelope through the cell door. Webb does not move from his bunk immediately. He waits. 3 minutes pass. Then he reaches down, picks up the envelope, and opens it without sitting up, reading its contents flat on his back in the dark, the way a man reads something he has been expecting. Investigators freeze the footage. They enlarge it. They run every enhancement available. They cannot see what is in the envelope, but what they find next, buried in a locked evidence log that should never have been accessible to a corrections officer of Reyes' clearance level, is something that reframes everything. Daniel Reyes had been accessing files, internal investigation files, files related to an ongoing federal inquiry into the very network Marcus Webb was alleged to be running. He had not been a corrections officer protecting the facility. He had been something else entirely. And when they finally traced his last known location to a parking garage in Hunts Point, and when they opened the trunk of the rusted Chevy Malibu registered to a name nobody recognized, what they found inside changed the entire shape of the investigation. The parking garage on Hunts Point Avenue smelled like oil and cold concrete, and something else. Something that made the two detectives who pushed through the stairwell door stop walking the moment they hit the third level. Detective Sergeant Amara Osei had been with the NYPD for 14 years. She had worked homicide for 6 of them. She had learned early in her career that certain smells bypassed the rational mind entirely, that they spoke directly to something older and more animal inside the human brain, something that said, quietly and without drama, that what you were about to see could not be unseen. She pulled on her gloves. Her partner, Detective Ray Kowalski, a 20-year veteran with a bad knee and a worse disposition, was already on the phone calling it in before they even reached the vehicle. The Chevy Malibu was parked in the far corner of the third level, backed into the shadows with the kind of deliberate positioning that people use when they do not want their license plate visible from the ramp. The car was registered to a shell name, a ghost identity that federal analysts would spend the next 72 hours trying to unravel. The trunk had been popped from the inside, not forced, not broken into, opened from within the vehicle by someone who had access to the latch release. Inside the trunk was a leather satchel, a prepaid burner phone, with 17 outgoing calls in the last 9 days, a folded document that turned out to be an internal Department of Correction personnel roster, with certain names circled in red ink and a digital voice recorder, small and black and unremarkable, of the kind journalists and investigators carry. Daniel Reyes was not in the trunk. That fact landed harder than anyone expected, because the smell and the positioning and the popped latch had told a story that turned out to be incomplete. The car had been used as a dead drop, a transfer point, not a disposal site. Someone had left these items here intentionally, either for someone else to collect, or as a warning, or possibly both. It was the voice recorder that broke the case open at its seams. Assay bagged it, tagged it, and within 4 hours it was playing through the speakers of a conference room on the 7th floor of one police plaza with representatives from the NYPD, the Department of Investigation, and 2 federal agents from the Southern District of New York sitting around the table in the particular silence of people who understand they are listening to something they cannot unhear. The recording was 43 minutes long. The first voice on the recording was Daniel Reyes, nervous, slightly breathless, speaking in a low register as though he was aware that volume itself was a liability. The second voice was one that nobody in the room immediately recognized, male, older, deliberate in his phrasing, with the specific cadence of someone who had spent a long time learning how to say dangerous things in careful language. The conversation was not about Marcus Webb. It was about the people above Marcus Webb. What Reyes described on that recording in fragments and half-sentences and long pauses that investigators would later say felt like a man choosing each word with the awareness that it might be his last, was a network that had been operating inside Rikers for at least 4 years. Not a gang? Not exactly. Something more structured than that and more dangerous, because it wore institutional clothing. It had corrections officers inside it. It had administrative staff. It had, according to Reyes, at least 2 individuals operating within the legal apparatus that was supposed to be holding the entire system accountable. He used the word compromised 7 times in 43 minutes. He never used names. Not once. He referred to the key figures by position, only a habit that suggested he had been coached, or that he was sophisticated enough to understand that names on a recording are evidence, but positions create ambiguity that lawyers can work with. But he described transactions. He described a specific protocol for passing information out of the facility disguised in routine paperwork. He described a corrections officer, not himself, who had been recruited 18 months earlier after a gambling debt made him vulnerable. He described a paralegal who processed court documents and had been quietly altering filing dates to delay hearings, keeping certain detainees inside Rikers longer than their legal timeline required because certain people needed certain men inside those walls for reasons that had nothing to do with the justice system. And then, at the 31-minute mark, Reyes said something that made one of the federal agents reach forward and press pause. He said, "They already know someone is talking. They have someone inside the investigation." The room went quiet in a different way after that. Because there had been an internal inquiry running parallel to the federal one. Small, discreet, handled by a unit within the Department of Investigation that was supposed to operate in a sealed information environment. The existence of that inquiry was not public. It had not been leaked to the press. The number of people who knew it existed could be counted on two hands. If Reyes knew about it, he had not learned it from the outside. The federal agent who had pressed pause was named Supervisory Special Agent Claire Donnelly. She was 44 years old, meticulous, and had built her career on financial crime and institutional corruption cases. She had a reputation for being difficult to rattle. Her colleagues would later say that the look on her face in that conference room was the first time any of them had seen her genuinely unsettled. She did not press play again immediately. Instead, she asked the room a question that nobody had an answer to. Who authorized the internal inquiry? And who has the full list of personnel assigned to it? The answer, when it came, was that the authorization had been signed by a deputy commissioner who had retired 8 months earlier. The personnel list was stored on a secure internal server. Access to that server was logged, and the logs were supposed to be reviewed weekly. The last log review had been 6 weeks ago. In the gap between that review and the present moment, someone had accessed the personnel file 41 times using a credential that belonged to a mid-level analyst who was currently on medical leave and had not, according to her personal physician, been anywhere near a computer in 3 months. Someone had been using her login. Someone had been watching the investigation watch them. Ase left the conference room and walked to the window at the end of the hallway and stood there for a moment looking out over the city. 14 years of homicide work had given her a particular relationship with the moment when a case reveals its true shape, when what looked like a missing person case or a corruption inquiry peels back and shows you the thing underneath it, the thing that was always there just waiting to be seen. This was not a case about Daniel Reyes. Reyes was a thread. Someone had pulled him, and now he was gone, and the question was not just where he was, but who had decided he needed to disappear, and how far up that decision had traveled before someone signed off on it. She called his mother that evening. Carmen Reyes answered on the second ring, the way mothers answer when they have been sitting next to the phone. Ase told her they were following active leads. She told her Daniel was central to an important investigation. She told her they were doing everything they could. What she did not tell her was that earlier that afternoon, the burner phone from the satchel had received an incoming text message from an unregistered number. 4 words: "Stop looking. He's safe." And that below those 4 words was a photograph taken from a distance, slightly blurred by movement or nerves, but clear enough to make out the subject without any difficulty at all. It was Amara Osei, walking into one police plaza that morning. Someone had been outside that building, watching who walked through the door, cataloging the faces of the people now holding the recorder and the satchel, and the 43 minutes of Daniel Reyes' careful, frightened voice. The investigation had a target, and the target was standing in a hallway on the 7th floor, holding a phone, realizing for the first time that she was no longer just chasing the case. She was inside it. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with a racing heart or a sharp intake of breath. It settles in slowly, the way cold water rises, steady and quiet and patient, until you realize that the ground beneath you has been disappearing for longer than you noticed. Amara Ase stood in that hallway on the 7th floor of one police plaza. and felt that kind of fear move through her, with the precision of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. She did not show it. She walked back into the conference room, set the burner phone on the table face up so everyone could see the screen, and said, calmly and without decoration, "We have a problem." The photograph changed everything about how the investigation operated from that point forward. Within 24 hours, Osei had been moved off the primary case file, a protective measure that she understood intellectually, but resented with every instinct she had spent 14 years sharpening. A smaller sealed unit was assembled, 4 people only, with no digital paper trail connecting them to the original inquiry. They communicated through courier documents and in-person meetings held in locations that rotated daily. Agent Claire Donnelly ran the unit with the focused intensity of someone who had stopped sleeping properly and made peace with that decision. She had pulled the 43-minute recording apart line by line, and she had built a list not of names because Reyes had given them none, but of positions, descriptions, behavioral markers, the kind of institutional fingerprints that a person leaves behind without realizing it, simply by the way they move through a system they believe they control. The paralegal who had been altering filing dates was identified within 72 hours. Her name was Sonia Vega, 29 years old, 3 years into a position at a mid-size firm that handled a significant volume of Rikers-related pre-trial cases. She had no criminal record. She had a younger brother who had been a detainee at Rikers 18 months earlier on a charge that was eventually dismissed, and who had, during his time inside, been housed on the same block as Marcus Webb. That was the thread. When investigators brought Sonia Vega into a nondescript office in Lower Manhattan on a Wednesday morning, she did not ask for a lawyer immediately, which Donnelly noted as significant. People who have been coached ask for lawyers before they sit down. People who are frightened and cornered and looking for a way out sometimes talk first, because talking feels like agency, and agency feels like survival. Sonia Vega talked. She talked for 4 hours, and what came out of those 4 hours was the clearest picture anyone had yet assembled of what was actually operating inside and around Rikers Island. It was not, as the early framing of the case had suggested, primarily a story about gang influence corrupting corrections officers. That element existed, but it was the surface layer, the visible part of something that went much deeper and had been growing for much longer. What Sonia described was a protection architecture, a system designed not to move contraband or control territory, though both of those things happened as byproducts, but to manage information, specifically to manage which cases moved quickly through the court system and which ones stalled, which detainees spent 8 months at Rikers and which ones spent 3 years, and why those outcomes aligned with remarkable consistency with the financial interests of a network that had members operating in law and city government and inside the Department of Correction itself. Marcus Webb was not the architect of this system. He was a node in it, an important one, a man whose pretrial detention had been deliberately extended because his presence inside Rikers made him useful as a communication hub, insulated from the kind of surveillance that would have followed him on the outside. The people running him from above were not facing charges. They were not inside any facility. They were attending meetings, signing documents, and in at least one case, according to Sonia, sitting on an oversight board whose stated purpose was reforming the very institution they were quietly exploiting. The name she gave them, the name she had heard only once spoken by her brother in a phone call he believed was private, was a name that made Claire Donnelly close her notebook and sit very still for a moment. It was a name that belonged to a man with a public profile, a man who had given speeches about criminal justice reform, a man whose photograph had appeared in newspapers alongside mayors and commissioners and advocacy groups fighting for the rights of the very detainees his network was using as pieces on a board. His name was Gerald Farrow, 61 years old, former attorney, current board member of 2 nonprofit organizations with direct contractual relationships with New York City's Department of Correction, a man who had spent 20 years building a reputation as one of the most credible voices in the reform space, which meant he had access, trust, and the single most valuable commodity in any criminal enterprise, which is legitimacy. The arrest was not dramatic, which felt somehow appropriate for a man who had spent decades mastering the appearance of calm. Farrow was taken into federal custody on a Thursday afternoon outside a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, where he had just finished a lunch meeting with a city council member who would later tell reporters he had no knowledge of any of it, a claim investigators found credible and deeply uncomfortable in equal measure. Farrow did not resist. He did not speak. He looked at the agents surrounding him with an expression that several of them would later describe independently and in almost identical terms as unsurprised, as though he had known this moment was coming, as though he had simply been calculating how long he had left. Daniel Reyes was found 11 days after Farrow's arrest. He was alive. He was in a rented room in Philadelphia, 45 minutes from the city he had fled, living under a name that was not his, having made the decision sometime in late February that the manila envelope he had delivered to Marcus Webb's cell, an envelope containing not sensitive documents as investigators had assumed, but a handwritten warning that the federal inquiry had been compromised from inside, was the last thing he could do before he disappeared. He had not been a participant in the network. He had spent 8 months documenting it, alone, without authorization, without backup, driven by something that he struggled to articulate when Jose finally sat across from him in a federal building in Philadelphia and asked him simply why. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. Then he said, "Because I watched what that place does to people, and I watched the people who were supposed to stop it make money off it instead, and I thought if I didn't do something, nobody would." Jose wrote that down, not because she needed it for the case. The case was built. Farrow's network unraveled over the following months with the momentum of something that had been held together by reputation alone, and once the reputation cracked, everything behind it came apart quickly. 14 individuals were indicted. 7 entered guilty pleas. Sonia Vega received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation. Marcus Webb's trial finally, after 22 months of deliberate delay, moved forward. Jose wrote it down because it was the truest thing anyone had said to her in the entire investigation. The system had been broken deliberately by people who understood it well enough to know exactly which pieces to move and which to leave in place, and who had calculated correctly for a very long time that the noise and the chaos and the chronic dysfunction of a place like Rikers would cover their work the way deep water covers anything thrown into it. They had been almost right. Gerald Farrow was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. On the day of his sentencing, a journalist asked him if he had anything to say. He looked at the camera for a moment with that same expression, that measured, calculating stillness, and then he said, "Rikers needs reform." And then he was led away. 3 months after the sentencing, a new oversight report was released detailing ongoing systemic failures at Rikers Island: understaffing, unmonitored cells, a backlog of internal investigations that had not been reviewed in over a year. The report was filed. It was assigned a case number, and somewhere in the building where these things are processed and logged and eventually buried, it settled to the bottom of a pile. The island sat in the middle of the East River, patient and indifferent, and waited. You just survived Rikers Island. If this story kept you locked in until the very last word, then you already know what to do. Hit subscribe because the next story is darker, deeper, and closer to home than you are ready for. Do not miss it.